This is my real-life Batman Taser Gauntlet that generates upwards of 400,000 volts and activates with the push of a button in my fingers, along with a front taser that when you touch anything conductive, it will shock it. In this video, you will learn how I built this Taser Gauntlet using a 3D printer, basic parts I found at my hardware store, and parts that I ordered off of Amazon. I do not recommend that any information you learn in this video you use to actually test it on yourself or anybody else. This is all just for fun and games, and it is also just a test of my ingenuity, so please, please, please do not use this to harm yourself or anybody else, and only use it to stimulate your big old brains, whoever is watching this. But in order to learn how I built this, we have to rewind about 5 days to when I was inspired to build this, so we have to take a trip back in time right now. This all began when I was just sitting in my workshop reading the new issue of Batman #1 when I noticed something shockingly amazing. Batman now had tasers built into his gloves to fight Killer Croc in the issue, and it made me think. I could make that. I could definitely make that. So that's exactly what I did. The first step in this build is sitting down and drawing out a rough sketch / blueprint of what I want everything to look like. Now, it won't look like the final product 100%, but it'll be just enough to give my brain a visualization of how everything will fit together and the parts needed to actually build a functional Taser Gauntlet. I draw out things such as the overall design of the glove, which will be based on Robert Pattinson's The Batman, as you can see here. The components going into the build will be simple things like wires, batteries, screws, and a voltage booster, which you can order off of Amazon, which I can show in a screen recording. You will also need a fly swatter, which I will go and pick up from the hardware store later. But everything you see here is fairly cheap and easily accessible, which makes this build a great starter for anyone wanting to get into building more functional, cool doohickeys like I'm doing in this video. But the overall sketch doesn't take long, and it helps me just clearly see what I want to do. Now that a rough sketch has been drawn out and it's been fully visualized on paper how I want the project to turn out, and we've gone over the different parts and components that will actually go into the build, there are certain things that we still need to get, like the fly swatter from either, I'm thinking, the dollar store or a hardware store. So that's what we're going to go do now. I will see you at the store where we collect everything we need to complete the gauntlet. Now that we're back in the workshop and all of the parts and components that will go into this build have actually been collected, it is time to build the glove itself. The first section that I will be building and explaining how to build is the front of the glove, which is the charge and release system as I've coined previously. Let's explain how I do that right now. The main portion of the build that's most important for the system is an electric fly swatter, and you may be wondering, how does something that kills tiny little insects actually transform into a taser? Well, there's a lot more shocking details to how this works than you might believe. The way an electronic fly swatter actually works is pretty simple, but still very cool. The circuit board inside the handle of an electronic fly swatter is what generates the high voltage energy, the shock behind what actually kills a fly. And the way it works is that there are two plates of metal typically that are charged negatively and positively, but the circuit is incomplete, meaning that the voltage and the shock cannot actually be delivered until both of those things are touching, or at least they have something conductive touching both of them at the same time, which is where the fly would come in the center, or just touching both of the plates at the same time, and that's when the circuit is complete, causing the shock to actually happen. And that's why I call it charge and release, is when you push the button on the handle of a fly shocker, it is building up charge within the circuit itself, but there's no way for it to actually be released because it's an incomplete circuit until the fly touches both the positive and negative metal plates. Why does this matter for the project of building a real Taser Gauntlet? Because the fly swatter itself is just housing for the mechanism of a charge and release shock. So theoretically, you take the wires from those metal plates and wire them to two prongs. They will be charged negatively and positively, and when you touch something conductive, that could be metal or something living like a fly or a person, the circuit will then be complete and it will shock whatever you touch. Now that it's been established how the circuit board inside the fly swatter works, it's time to take apart the swatter using a screwdriver. I at first used an incorrect size screwdriver, but after learning finally that size does matter, I used a different screwdriver to pop off the casing and get into the circuitry to actually see what I was working with. After I was able to get into the casing of the circuit board, I actually had to remove the real metal plates on each side of the swatter using the same screwdriver, just slowly prying back each layer of metal. It wasn't easy and honestly kind of painful at points because at one point pulling back the metal plate I cut myself, and let's just say that it kind of hurt. But in the end I was able to properly take everything apart without breaking anything, and we can actually see what it looks like now. Now that the main component of the fly swatter has been removed, you can see what I was talking about on the chalkboard with the circuit board, which I should have further elaborated is actually acting as a capacitor, which is why the circuit is not completed unless something conductive connects the 2 points. But when you put 2 AA batteries in, let's just see how this works, because I might have screwed it up in the process, but usually it's a good sign if the red light turns on and you hear a bit of a buzzing noise. And let me move the camera down a bit. First test of the Batman Taser starts now. Lights on, noises. You get the point. It is not a very impressive shock, but it's enough that it actually does hurt. And trust me, I have shocked myself before because I've made a crappier version of this in the past. But it's still kind of cool, and it's just a simple way that you can make a taser at home. Now that we've built the palm section of the taser, it's time to move on to the real bread and butter of this project, and definitely the more dangerous version of the taser, which will go on the back of the hand, and that will be made with this little thing that you can get off of Amazon called a voltage booster. I think I talked about it before, but I'm going to further explain kind of how this works right now. So how can a 9-volt battery, something so small and so simple that you see almost every day probably if you're surrounded by electronics, how can something like this deliver a high voltage arc across 2 points of metal? Like said, it has to do with this little thing called a voltage booster, but exactly how does this work in order to transform this into upwards of 400,000 volts? Well, as you can see here, I drew a very barbaric diagram of what's happening, but I'll explain it the best I can, and I'm not a scientist, so I may be wrong, but this is my understanding of how it works. So you can see that this is meant to be the battery, and this is the voltage booster. And the way it works is when this is hooked up to this, the voltage runs through a circuit within this little thing. Voltage from the 9-volt battery runs into something called an inductor. And what an inductor does, it turns the voltage into a magnetic field. And on the other end of that magnetic field, what the inductor does is it spurts out a higher boost of voltage. And usually what happens is it runs through a complete circuit with something called a transistor, which is like a very quick on and off switch, like very quick, so quick that you wouldn't even notice it. And what happens is it circles back around. But what happens is that when this turns off, a little bit of voltage spills over into a capacitor, which is on the fly swatter as well, but it's a bit different, is that the extra voltage over and over again is being dumped into this capacitor, built up. So the 9 volts soon becomes the upwards of 400,000 volts because the circuit is spitting out voltage over time into this capacitor where it's built up and then released into these 2 wires, which will be connected to metal prongs, and that is where the arc comes from. Now that it has been explained how the voltage booster works, it's time to take our soldering iron and some solder and plug everything in and actually wire up the voltage booster to the 9-volt battery in a momentary switch. A couple important things to note here is you definitely should not be doing this how I'm doing this, since I definitely did not take my safety into as much consideration as I should have, as some of the fumes that come off of the wires when you're soldering them definitely aren't good to breathe in. I was kind of in a ventilated area, but it's still not good practice to do this without a face mask or something of the sort. Now that my expert soldering skills have been put on display, hopefully if I wired up everything correctly, the circuit within the voltage booster should be enough to create an arc between these 2 points. 3, 2, 1. I'd say that's a success. So What does this mean going forward? We have to actually take apart everything properly, measure the components, and model them into the design of a gauntlet so it looks very clean and compact and concise. But as a functionality standpoint goes, both sides of the Taser work, which is a complete win, and I am super excited to finish the build. I will see you guys tomorrow. It is now the next day, and with everything roughly assembled and wired together, it is actually time to measure each of the components, just their basic width, length, and height measurements, along with also measuring my wrist and my forearm just to make sure that I can scale everything properly digitally using Fusion 360 and Orca Slicer. Like I said, I just record everything in my notebook, measuring each of the parts, making sure that I have a rough outline of where I want them to sit inside the gauntlet. That way, when come printing, I don't have to actually remodel or reprint everything. It's just kind of the first go kind of deal. Using my big old brain, I can use Fusion 360 to model the front and back and just everything that holds all the Taser components together. I use basic geometry and shapes, so it's really nothing complicated, but I do have a screen recording just so you can kind of see an outline of what I did. I made sure that all the holes were properly scaled so that the screws could fit into them and nothing would be too snug or too tight when come time to assemble everything. I also made sure to keep in mind that everything I designed, I kind of wanted to have a bat theme, so the back is literally just shaped like a bat, while the front just is in the Batman logo kind of shape. The component for the fly swatter holder is just a rectangle, and it was definitely the easiest part to model. It's just, like I said, a rectangle with 3 different holes modeled into it so that the wires and batteries can fit through it. Then using Orca Slicer, I oriented each of the parts in the best way possible so that they would use the least amount of support material when printing, and I would just be able to save on material for future projects. This is also the point in time where I exported the Battinson Gauntlet and made sure again it was oriented properly and all the supports were in the right place. Once all the Taser component parts were printed in PLA along with the Gauntlet model being printed in PLA as well, it was time to assemble everything into their correct position and holders, and everything fit great. It was really looking up and I was super excited to finish the build until I wasn't. Everything was going great, and it really just came down to extending a couple of wires and putting things back in place, painting the gauntlet, and then I'd be done, but I made a mistake. Just so there's a little understanding of what's going on, I kind of screwed up the button, so we're going to have to use some top-level ingenuity to try and solder on this wire. Let's hope it works, because I'm a little stressed out right now. I'd have to go buy more parts if it doesn't. I tried my best to fix everything and try and actually solder the wire back onto the button, because what happened was the prong got torn off, but with all my effort, it still wasn't enough, which meant the worst had come to worst, and this video was actually at risk of not coming out on time because I had to go and buy more parts, and I didn't even know if I could find the correct parts, so I'd have to go and order everything. Well, I screwed up, but it's not over. I'll just have to go to Ace Hardware today so that I can go and find one of these momentary switches, because what happened was I accidentally snipped off one of the prongs that is meant to solder onto, which means I'm really working with nothing trying to reconnect the wires. So, unfortunately, and a little bit of stress and upsetness going on, I gotta go to the store and buy more parts, so yeah. But, as Nick A30 would say, never back down, never give up. So, not gonna give up. But with my optimism already dwindling, it didn't get any better in the coming morning because I was faced with a lot of crappiness over and over again. I just got back from going into my local Ace Hardware, and there's some good news and some unfortunate bad news. The good news is I found some heat shrink tube wrapping for all the wiring. The bad news is they didn't have the momentary switch I was looking for, and the closest place is 30 minutes away, but there's no video without getting this switch, and there's no project at all, so I have to make a trip to the town nearby to get that switch, which I'm a little frustrated, but it's alright. I want to get this done, and we're gonna get it done no matter what, so I'm gonna head to that store in the other town 30 minutes away. Yeah. At the Home Depot, the next town over, and it just keeps getting worse, is they don't even have what I need, so I have to go another town over, which would mean an hour away from where I live, and it's quite frustrating. because it was working and then I broke it. But I don't know what I'm going to do. If I don't get this switch, then the video just doesn't happen, which it's pretty frustrating. I wouldn't say it doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen soon. I'd have to order the part. But I'm hoping that going to this next Home Depot department store, another 30 minutes away, will have what I need and I can get this entire thing done today. But we'll see, I guess. So yeah, I'm gonna head there now. But finally, after being on a wild goose chase what felt like forever, but really was just one morning, I found what I needed and the video was saved. So we got what we needed. I actually don't need the fly swatter components like I did for the front of the palm. I just need that button that's right here. It's a momentary switch and I could not find it anywhere else. So I had to go over an hour away just to spend money on a fly swatter. And I actually bought two because if I broke one again, I didn't want to have to come back here and drive that far and buy it again. So I thought buy two and really secure the fact that I have what I need to finish this video. But now I get to head home and actually complete the build. It was at this point, finally, after acquiring a functioning switch, that I was able to rewire everything back to a working state. Then I could put everything in the right place where it belonged inside the Gauntlet with the pieces that I had modeled. Everything needed to be glued on with hot glue. Also, I used Velcro to secure some things that I wanted to be able to remove when I needed to, like the battery or some of the wires. But overall, at this point, it was just making sure everything fit before I was ready to paint it all black, and then the Gauntlet would be done. I taped off all the screws and electronic components and just used a matte black spray paint to cover the entire 3D printed parts and make sure that it was a nice Batman black and had the look of a true crime fighter. After the paint was dry, I could finally say that this project was done. After days of hard work, moments of stress and uncertainty, it was finally time to put on the Gauntlet, make sure everything still fit, and I could become my own true Batman with a real working, tasing Gauntlet. So, this is the fully finished Taser Gauntlet, Batman Taser Gauntlet, Shock Gauntlet, whatever you would wish to call it. It is finished, and it works extremely well, better than I was hoping. Definitely met my expectations of the build and the video in general. But the back of the Gauntlet, like I said, works with an arc taser kind of system, and it works with the press of a button in my glove, if you can see right there. It's not glued to anything because when I use the front palm Gauntlet, which I'll show in a second, I don't want this button to be anywhere near my fingers in case I accidentally press it and I shock myself, because I don't want to feel what that feels like. But like I said, I still have to show off the front of the Gauntlet, which works with the push of the button on my forearm. You can kind of hear the sound that it makes when it's building up charge to shock something, but I'll show that off right now. The front of the taser works with a button on the actual Gauntlet. That way I don't confuse the two buttons when I'm wearing both of the systems at the same time, because if I did that, I could easily tase myself. But when you touch something conductive such as this metal stovepipe, as you will see, there are more conductive things that it works better on. I would assume that's just the way things are. Some metals allow energy to pass through more easily, I would suppose, so that will create a bigger spark, but it works well. Both systems work well, and that's an explanation of the front. Funny enough, right after recording this, I accidentally shocked myself. It's honestly kind of funny. Ow! Or shock yourself. I would say it works great. I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't want to touch this thing. But overall, I'm super happy with how it turned out, and I definitely think that this is something I could revisit and even make more electrifying. And by that, I mean quote-unquote dangerous. Nothing here is dangerous, right, guys? But fun project, fun build. Definitely tested some of my capabilities when it came to soldering and just wiring in general, but That's the whole point, is that it was a challenge that I completed, and now I have a real Batman Taser Gauntlet that I can tase myself with. On accident, right? But with all the stress behind us, the Gauntlet is finally done, and it is time to put it to rest alongside everything else in my Batcave.